All right, Matthew chapter 14. We have a story you may have heard before to cover today in verse 22 to 33. And let me just say I'm optimistic and thinking we're going to make it through, so we'll just see what happens. All right, so just as a reminder where we are looking at the life and work here of Jesus, kind of after he set out the parable of the different grounds, right? The stony ground, the hard ground, the thorny ground, right? And we've been looking at various examples of his ministry and how it has turned out that way. And we finally get to an example of good ground here with the disciples. So it's a nice change of pace, actually. I actually want to start at the end and make sure we understand where we're going. So we're going to start in verse 33. Verse 33 says, "Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" So here we have the disciples worshiping Christ, and it's the first time that we see them refer to him as the Son of God. We've had demons say it before. Back in chapter 8, we had the demons call him the Son of God, and of course the Father calls him his son at the baptism, but it's the first time the disciples actually get it. If you go over to chapter 16 real quick, 16 verse 15, we have this interaction between the disciples and Jesus says, "He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter answered and said, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.'" So here we see, after this point, they have gotten it. They understand who he is, and they understand what's going on. So this miracle that we are going to be looking at today was the one that kind of put them over the top to really understand that he was the Son of God. And so it's obviously a very important one, because up to this point they've seen miracle and miracle and miracle and miracle and heard teaching and teaching, but it's this particular miracle, or this sequence of miracles, I would probably say, between the feeding of the 5,000 and then what he does here, that really puts them off over the top. And it's no small thing to say that they worshipped him, right? Because they all understood that you don't worship anyone except God. That would not be kosher for them as Jews, to worship anyone except God. So they're saying, we understand your deity, we understand your God. What's interesting again, right? Jesus was worshipped before. He was worshipped by the wise men at his birth, right? He was worshipped by the leper again back in chapter 8. You'll remember that story. And of course, we see him worshipped in Revelations chapters 4, 5, 11, 19. I mean, all over chapter Revelation, we see that he's worshipped. But again, this is the first time that the disciples worship him, and so it's a critical miracle that we need to understand. All right, so let's go back to verse 22 and pick up the whole story. In verse 22, it says, "Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat, go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away." So the multitudes, if you remember from last week, the multitudes are the feeding of the 5,000, right? We've got the crowd, and when we say 5,000, that's 5,000 men. So again, probably more like 25,000 people, women and children in that crowd at this point. So it says here that he sends the disciples away. Now, I got to say, this has got to be like, whoa, why would you send us away? Right? If you remember, as we looked at John, after the feeding of the 5,000, the people were ready to make him king, and you got to think the disciples were going, "Yeah, man, let's go." Right? We're going to be kind of second in charge. Let's make him king. And so I think partly what's going on here is Jesus is protecting the disciples from themselves. In that the crowd again is trying to make him king. He did not want the disciples to get in on that whole thing that was going on there. But you know that they've got to be confused, right? They're 2.5 years following him. They don't want to go. It says in my translation that Jesus made the disciples get into a boat. Some of you translations will say he constrained them, he forced them, he commanded them. But you know that they are thinking this is the time, this is it. Finally, it's going to happen, and he sends them away. And again, I think that Jesus, in this particular miracle and at this particular time, is trying to get the disciples to the point where they really understand who he is and what his ministry is and what it's about and what the kingdom's about. And so he sends them away very intentionally in order for them to do that. Now, what's interesting is that he sends them away and then he sends the mob away. Right? They wanted him to be king, and he somehow sends 25,000 people away, which is interesting in and of itself, right? It shows, his. Well, we'll get to it in a minute, but it shows his authority over the people that he could do that. But one of the things I just want to mention here is that if you go to John, you'll find out that the mob actually comes back the next morning after Jesus and the disciples are gone. They're looking for breakfast, right? I mean, they've just had this meal and they're coming back. They're thinking, well, this is the thing now. We just hang around here. This guy's going to be king. He's going to feed us continually, etc. They were just completely confused about what his mission was. Anyway, so what I want to get done today as we go through this lesson is try to help you understand, why did the disciples worship him at this point, right? What is it about what he did and what happened here that they worshiped him? And the first thing is what I just mentioned a second ago, is that he shows incredible authority, right? He shows unusual authority. One, that he sends the disciples away. Second, that he sends the crowd away. But then, as we see, he also has control over the wind and the waves, right? I mean, Jesus has complete authority here over everything that's going on. And just to remind you, let me just go through some. We're not going to flip back, but just to remind you, you remember back at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, that the people responded, gee, this is someone who is teaching with authority, right? They recognized his authority right from the beginning. And then when he healed the centurion's child, remember the centurion's response was, I am one who is under authority. I understand the authority that you have, right? We've also seen before where Jesus and the disciples were in a boat, right? Jesus was asleep, and he gets up and has authority over the wind and the sea at that particular time. In Matthew chapter 9, we see his authority over sins. In Matthew chapter 10, we see his authority over diseases and to remove demons. And then we just saw in the the feeding of the 5,000, his authority over creation, right? In creating the fish, creating the bread. And then, of course, at the end of the book, we'll see in Matthew chapter 28, right? He'll make the statement, "All authority is given to me." So I think one of the reasons the disciples bow down and worship him is the recognition of his authority, recognition of his deity, right? He's in control of everything. He's in control of all things, spiritual and physical. All right. Let's go on to verse 24. Pick up the rest of the story. Wait a minute. We've missed something. Yeah, we missed verse 23. Why'd you all let me skip 23? All right, verse 23. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And now when evening came, he was alone there. So my question to you is, what is he praying about? He's up on the mountain to pray. What's on his prayer list? What's he praying about? This is when you respond to me.
He still got he knows what's coming still.
He knows what's coming. In what sense? What do you mean what's coming?
well, even just what's immediately coming in the next, hours, but also across the next few days.
Right? Okay.
Be
What
praying
else?
For the disciples.
Yeah.
Praying for the disciples. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. What we'll see as we go through this story is he's up there on the mountain. The disciples are out in the water. He knows what's going on, right? He's praying for the disciples for several things. One, he's praying that they understand, right? That they get it, that they come to this understanding of who he is and what his ministry is about. But then he's also praying for the disciples for their protection out there on the sea where they're in trouble. So yeah, I think praying for the disciples, no question, that's part of it. What else?
Well, he knows the people are coming back for breakfast.
He knows about the crowd, right? There's no question the crowd is on his heart, right? He knows that most of them do not understand who he is. They're just following him for the miracles. So yeah, praying for the crowd, no question. What else?
His own sanity. I mean, he's got to be getting tired.
That's probably not very good, but okay. What else? So let me add. I'm sorry. I'm not really sorry, but anyway, let me add two other things. One thing I think that he's got to be praying for Thanksgiving, right? I mean, he's just had this amazing thing happen where he's been able to feed the 5,000. There's no question he's praying for Thanksgiving to the Father for what's just gone on. But the other big thing I think is the people have just come and tried to make him king, right? I think that there's a level of temptation that the devil is bringing on him, right? If you go all the way back to his temptation in the wilderness, right? Part of that temptation was, hey, Jesus, let's just make you king now. Let's forget all this stuff you're going to have to go through. Let's just make you king. I'll put you in charge of everything, right? That was Satan's temptation. I think the same temptation is here, right? Where he's thinking, man, I could just become king and I could bypass that whole cross thing, right? If he's fully human, that's got to be rolling around in his head, right? So I think that he's praying about that temptation with God, right? God, keep me from this. God, keep me on track with what I know that I need to do, et cetera. So I think all that's going on. I think praying for the disciples, praying for the crowd, praying for himself. David, in this way, I think, not to discount entirely what you said, but I think it's because of the temptation that he does have this stuff going on in his head. Yeah. Anything else there? So Jesus is on the mountain praying. All right, let's go on then to verse 24. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So the boat is in the middle of the sea. How big is the Lake Galilee, by the way? Anybody know?
It's 7 miles at its widest point.
Yeah, it's about 7 miles by about 12 miles long, right? And so they're out in the midst of it. What's interesting is, they're going, as we mentioned last week, they're on the northeast coast, going to the northwest coast now, going back to Capernaum. This is probably about a 4-mile trip. Right. If you go to John, it actually says that they're 3 or 4 miles out into the sea, out in the middle. So, they're out there fighting the wind, fighting the waves, and they've gotten themselves out in the middle of this lake when, frankly, as good seamen, they should have been able to get across this lake in about an hour, maybe 2 at the most. But because of what's going on in this lake, they've been pushed out to the middle. They've been pushed out to the middle of this lake, and they're struggling. It says that in the other Gospels they were tossed, they were tormented. Here it says the wind was contrary to them, and John says it was a fierce wind. So you remember that the last time they were in a storm like this, Jesus is in the back of the boat, right? And they just have to go and wake him up. This time, Jesus is not there in the boat with him. And in fact, there's no way for Jesus to get there, because if you read it in John, it says that when the people came the next day, there were no boats. So there's no boats. They took the only boat out into the water. They know there's no way for Jesus can get to them. He's not in the boat. So the thing that an overriding message that we need to see here in this example is that Jesus is continuing to grow their faith, right? When Jesus was in the boat with them, all they had to do is go over and wake him up and he could save the day. Now Jesus is not in the boat. And all of a sudden they've got to deal with this issue without Jesus being in the boat. This is a harder press on their faith, if you will. Okay. And by the way, this is surely a picture of the church. This is the church right now. This is the followers. These are the disciples that are in the boat. This is the church, and they're in the midst of these stormy waters. This is no question amidst a picture of the church in the midst of the world. And they're trying to make it in the sea without Christ, facing sin, facing temptation, facing persecution, facing false doctrine. There's no question that this picture here is of the church in the midst of the sea of the world. Now, I will say, and it's important to say, that the disciples are doing exactly what Jesus asked them to do, right? He said, get in the boat and go to Capernaum. And so they are being obedient. They're not rebelling. They're doing what he wants them to do. However, they're still in a storm, right? Just because they're doing what he asked them to do does not mean that the storm does not come. Does not mean that the wind does not push against them. Does not mean that they are frightened, right? But they didn't turn back. They kept going forward. But in the midst of their obedience, they meet the storm. Again, this ought to be encouraging to us. I mean, sometimes we get this picture that, oh no, when things are going bad, God must be angry with me. Maybe I'm being disobedient. Maybe I need, etc. And sometimes that's true, of course, but it's not always true, because we see this very example here where the disciples were doing exactly what Jesus asked them to do. They were pointed towards Capernaum, and yet they're in the midst of a storm. They're having a tough time. So go back to verse 24. So the boat's in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves. The wind is contrary. If you go to John, and we're not going to take the time to go there, but John 6:48 says that he saw them distressed and he saw them struggling, right? So Jesus is up on the mountain. He's 3 miles away. By the way, I looked it up. If you stand on the beach and you look out at the ocean and you see a boat out there at the very edge of the waters, that's approximately 3 miles out. You can actually see 3 miles. That's the kind of the edge of human vision. So Jesus, however, is up on a mountain looking down over the sea. By the way, it's the middle of the night. It's dark. There's a storm going on. So it's not really possible for Jesus to see them, but Jesus sees them. Right? You get that? It's not really possible for him to physically see them, but he sees them. He knows what's going on. They don't know, the disciples don't realize, as we've just mentioned, that Jesus is up on the mountain and he's praying for them. Jesus is praying for them. It's I'll say this maybe again later, but it's the most secure place they could possibly be. They're right in the middle of what God's will is, what Jesus has asked them to do. They're being obedient, and Jesus is praying for them. They could not be more secure. They could not be more safe, and yet they're terrified. Right? Jesus knows what's going on. Proverbs 15:3, in case you don't know where it is, right? The eyes of the Lord are on everything. Jesus sees them. He sees them in the midst of the storm. Again, the lesson for us is Jesus sees us in the midst of our storm. He knows what's going on. He sees it. It's not that he's not paying attention. He is paying attention, and he sees it and knows what's going on. All right, let's keep going. Verse 25. Now, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. So many of you probably know that the Jewish clock, if you will, followed the Roman clock, which was divide the evening up into watches. Of course, when they used to have guards that watched every number of hours. And so the fourth watch is actually from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. All right, so this is when this happens. So again, middle of the night, it's dark. There's a storm going on. And the disciples, if you remember, they left when it was evening. So that is more around 6 o'clock. So from 6 o'clock until 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning, they've been fighting this storm. They've been in this storm a long time. And this is part of the reason that they are struggling with what's going on, because they've been in a long time and they've not seen anything that's going to break their way. So verse 25 again, now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. I love that there's no trumpets here. There's no brass band playing, right? Jesus just went for a walk. And he's just walking on the sea. I mean, the way that this is stated is so matter of fact. It's just kind of amazing to me, right? He just took a walk. He's going out on the sea. Oh, by the way, there's a storm going on. It's dark. The wind is blowing. The rain is coming down. Lightning is flashing, and he's going for a walk on the sea. In Job chapter 9, verse 8, there's a verse that says, "God alone treadeth on the waves of the sea." God alone treadeth on the waves of the sea, right? This is not normal human behavior for Jesus to be going out. Now, again, he knows where they are. Darkness is not a problem for me. And again, Psalm 139:12, the night and the day is the same to me. He can see just perfectly fine. The darkness is irrelevant to him. The distance is not a problem. The waves are not a problem. The wind is not a problem. Whatever the storm is not a problem for Jesus to get there. There's nothing that can hinder him from being there. Now, I will ask you this question. Why didn't he go earlier? These guys have been out there fighting this thing for hours, all night long. Why didn't Jesus go earlier?
Because he didn't want to.
Thank you, CT. And why didn't he want to?
His plan.
Thank you. Why was it his plan?
A matter of timing in God's economy to test their faith. You think that the big picture here, they were out. I'm just looking at this on, I've got a little map in my Bible that they were basically just running along the shoreline, going from Capernaum to Gennesaret, where they landed. And they're out in the middle of the storm. They don't have any navigation capability whatsoever. They can be out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for all they know. So that's just a matter of time. God's testing them to see how long they can hold out, I guess, or just to strengthen their faith.
Yeah, and the other thing I would just say, just to clarify, I mean, they should have been going along the shore, right? That would have been the smart way to navigate, but somehow they've gotten, John says they're out in the middle of the lake, 3 to 4 miles. So somehow they've gotten way off course out there. So yes, but to your point, to test their faith. Any other thoughts on that? Is that something God does?
Just kind of wait until they were at just point of hopelessness and devastation.
That's what I was gonna say. He showed up 30 seconds into the emergency. Wasn't much of an emergency.
You know, people say when they're looking for something, I found it in the last place I looked. Well, of course it was the last place you looked. That's right, because you stopped looking after that. But it's a very, I think you guys have hit it on the nail, right? He's actually trying to grow their faith. He's not in the boat, just as we don't have him in the room, right? He's not in the boat, but he wanted to test their faith, and he gets them to the extreme of their abilities to say, we're going to die out here, right? There's no way for us to save us. We've seen this picture before, right? We've seen it with Mary and Martha with the death of Lazarus, right? When Jesus shows up, they say, you're too late, right? He's already dead. He's been in the grave for a couple of days. He stinks, right? But Jesus is trying to test their faith. We see it when Peter's in prison and Jesus doesn't come until after he's been in prison all night long. He doesn't break him out right away. Heaven's clock runs at a different rate than ours does. and it's all about him pushing us to extend our faith such that we really will trust him for the next storm, for the next time we're out there without him, for the next time we don't see the shoreline and we can't find the guidance to get us home. Jesus knows exactly what this storm is like. He knows your boat. He knows the boat you're in. He knows who's in the boat with you. The other thing what's interesting is Jesus walks on top of the storm to get there. Jesus uses the storm to get to them. He uses the trial as a footpath to get to the disciples. He uses the storm for them to see him. He uses the storm to smack them in the face so that they will see him. And I think he does the same thing in our lives.
And so you used a couple different phrases there about testing faith and establishing faith or extending faith. When I hear testing faith, I think it's almost different than establishing faith. Do you think they're the same, or do you?
Hold that thought for a minute, because Jesus addresses that in a couple of sentences. So hold that thought.
Glad I could set you up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
So Rich, by this time, he's taught them how to pray. Do you find it interesting that it does not mention anything that they prayed for their lives? That, hey, Jesus, we need to be praying that he's coming our way?
Yes, it's insane, right? They've just had the feeding of the 5,000, right? They just saw him create stuff. They know that he's the creator God, and they don't sit there and go, "Oh, Jesus, come help us." Right? What's going on in their brains? So again, they're not there yet, right? They're not there to really understanding who he is until after this occurrence. So yeah, absolutely, David. And in fact, in John's version of this, it says they've forgotten that he had just fed the 5,000, right? They actually say that they forgot that he had just fed them when they're out there in the boat. So they don't remember that he's there. So just to summarize where we are before we go on to the next point, why are they worshiping him? One, because they see his authority, but secondly, right here, because of his divine knowledge. He knows, right? He knows what's going on. He sees them. He's aware of everything that they're in the middle of and going through. Yeah, good point, David. We're gonna bounce back on that a little bit later. All right, verse 26, I think we are. Verse 26, and when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Mark makes a point of saying that they all saw him and that he was near the boat, right? They all saw him. That it wasn't just Peter. But you take for a minute the disciples' position. They're in the dark. they're in a storm, they're dark, they're weary, they're hopeless, and now they see somebody walking on the water. I think they're just totally freaked out at this point, right? And they believed in spirits and phantoms. They're thinking this is the spirit of the sea that's coming to gobble us up, right? This word they say here, he's troubled. They're upset. They're in panic. They're terrified, and they say it's a phantom. It's a ghost. It's a spirit of some kind. I mean, it's it's interesting, right? We see this in other times when. Remember when Mary was at the tomb and she sees Jesus and thinks he's the gardener, right? Or the disciples on the road to Emmaus and they don't know who this guy is talking to them. I mean, there are times when people did not see who Jesus was when he was standing right in front of them. There's a story back in Genesis. You remember the story of Jacob's ladder, right? And what's interesting is Jacob, after that interaction, it's in Genesis 28. After that interaction with him, he says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was unaware of it." Right? Listen, this is us, okay? This is not just the disciples in the middle of their storm. This is us in the middle of our storms. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was unaware of it, right? We do not recognize when Jesus comes. We don't recognize when Jesus acts even, or when he saves us. We think, well, that's just a phantom. Of course, we call it things like, that's just a coincidence. Boy, were we lucky, right? They were not expecting Christ to come, were they? Right? There was no boat. There's no way for them to get. They were not expecting him. And frankly, neither are we. In the midst of our storms, we're not expecting Jesus to show up. We're so overwhelmed with the storm, with what's going on, we don't expect him to show up. And when he does, we often say, wow, was I fortunate? Okay, verse 27. But immediately, Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." They cried out, and immediately Jesus responded. They cried out, and immediately Jesus responded. Jesus is waiting for us to cry out. Jesus says to them, "Cheer up." My version here says, "It is I." What it actually says in the Greek is, "I am." Cheer up, I am. Do not fear, right? He's again saying, it's me, the I am. It's me, the deity. It's me, God. It's me. Do not fear. I think these words, cheer up, I am, do not fear, became watchwords for the disciples, right? As they face things later, as we see them in Acts, going through the struggles and going through the trials. Cheer up, it is I, do not fear. I think that rolled in their heads, so they knew that Jesus was with them in the midst of all the things that they went through. I am, therefore do not fear. I am, therefore do not fear. I am here, therefore do not fear. Stop fearing, I am here. Do not fear me, and do not fear the waves. Yeah, and this is, by the way, where it's actually in Mark. I said John. It's in Mark where it says they considered not the miracle of the loaves. David, to your point, right? They did not think that Jesus was going to show up. So in the extremities of life, you do not need to fear, is what the message is here. As Christians, we don't need to fear. Well, why? Because what's the worst that can happen? With Christ, we need not fear any storm. I can't make that personal for you, You got to make that personal for yourself, but that is the message that we're getting here. They were obedient. They were doing what God told them to do, and there's no safer place than that. You remember last week when Daniel preached in John 15, he talked about abiding in God's love, right? When you abide in God's love, there's no safer place than that. In Jude, it says, keep yourselves in the love of God, in that relationship, in the knowledge of who he is. No safer place than that. All right, so
Hey,
why
Rich,
did they work? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Rich, I mean, I'm just saying, it seemed like for us today, though, it should be easier because of God's Holy Spirit.
Not only, yes, absolutely, positively, 100% agree. And we have all these amazing messages. We have the word of God written down for us, right? I mean, it should be so much easier for us in the midst of our storms.
One thing I see in there too, Rich, is he is building their character. He's making them face their fear. You're out there by yourself. I mean, to me, it looks like obviously he's doing it on purpose, but he's doing it to build their character so they will depend on him next time a storm comes. They know what to do.
Absolutely. And you guys know, when we went through Joe's cancer, it was the most building of my faith that has ever occurred in my life, right? It stretched my faith when she went through her cancer. And I think that's the storms that God puts in our path in order to stretch our faith, in order for us to see him, for us to understand who he is and what he is. And I know many of you have had similar situations. So I'm just reminding you of those things. All right. I don't know where we are. 27. Is that right? No, that's where we were.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just remind you again, they worshiped him because of his authority. They worshiped him because of his knowledge. They worship him here because of his care and his protection, right? So let's keep going into the story. Yeah, so the other thing, just to in verse whatever when we are now in, immediately Jesus spoke to them, right? Jesus speaks to us also, right? He speaks to us through, as we've just said, through the word. He speaks to us through prayer. He speaks to us through the Holy Spirit within us. So Jesus speaks to us and says the same thing, right? Be of good cheer. I am. Do not fear. He has told us that and told us that over and over and over again. All right, now let's look at this next interaction with Peter in verse 28. And by the way, this little story of Peter is only in Matthew. It's not in the other Gospels. This little interaction that he has here with Peter. Verse 28, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So he said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. So I just got to say, Jesus walking on the water, this is like, man, that's amazing. But hey, he's Jesus, right? Peter walking on the water, man, that's that crazy, stupid Peter guy. He's like me, right? And he's walking on the water. This is something fantastic. Now, I got to ask, why did Peter do this? Why did Peter say, hey, let me come out there and walk on the water with you?
Because he knows Jesus can do it.
He knows Jesus can do it, yes.
His faith has gotten to the point where he knows he can go to Jesus and Jesus will.
Yeah, but why didn't he say, hey, turn me into a fish? I mean, why does he ask him for this?
Well, you had said that the disciples were kind of getting big-headed and thinking, okay, Jesus is going to be made king and we're gonna be right there with him, so maybe he's showing off to the other 11, saying, okay, I'm gonna be top man, I'm gonna be the first one out of the boat. Just a thought.
No, it may be, David, and there are several of the commentaries who go down that road. It's his brashness, et cetera, right? You know, we know Peter, he's the first one to speak all the time, and that may be part of it. I don't think that's the main thing, though.
You think it's just a part, the human part of him going, man, walking on water, that's pretty cool. I said, I've never seen that, never heard of it. There's a part of me that said, he wants to experience the same thing that Jesus did. I think there's a human part of him. You know, we can get all spiritual about this, but he's human. Whoever walks on water. That's just maybe part of it.
Maybe part of it.
Be in his arms.
I think he gets it. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
What'd you say, Melody? I didn't hear you.
No, I was just saying, I think he just wants to be in his arms and protected by him.
And what were you going to say, Russell?
Yeah. So I think he gets it. I think he's like, well, I mean, if he can calm the storm like he did before, if he can feed the 5,000, there's nothing he can't do. I get it now. If he can do that, he can make me walk on water. I think he gets it.
Yeah, I think, you know, as we started right at the beginning, yes, it's no question that he understands his power, right? But I really think that the primary reason that he asked this question is what Melody said. He wants to be with Jesus. He sees Jesus out there in the water. I'm going, right? You remember when Jesus is resurrected and the fishermen are all out in the boat, right? And Peter recognizes him. He jumps in the water and wants to get to Jesus. I think it's the same thing here. Jesus is out there standing on the water. I'm coming, right? I want to be with Jesus. I love Jesus. I want to be with Jesus. I think that's the motivation that's going on here. Yeah, this other stuff about, you know, he's brash and he wants to be the first one and all that stuff, maybe. But I think the primary motivation here is love. And you remember at the end, after Peter has denied him, and Jesus says to Peter, you know, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Right? It was always about that love relationship between Peter and Jesus. And that's why it hurt Peter so much when Jesus would ask him, do you love me? And I think so. So I think what you're seeing here is Peter's love for him. And I will also say, and what does Jesus respond? He says, come, right? He says, come on, Peter, right? And I would think if this came out of a sinful place, that Jesus would not be encouraging it, right? If it was just out of his brashness, and I'm not saying there's not part of that in here, but if it was just out of that, that would be a sinful reason. And Jesus would not say, come. He says, stay in the boat, Peter. But he says, come, because I believe it's a love relationship. It's a response to love, and it's a response to his faith, as you have said, right? It's a response to the faith that he has. He's encouraging that faith. He wants to expand that faith. I will also say that he couldn't come to Jesus unless Jesus said come, right? Unless Jesus helped him to get there. But and then, you know, it says here, he went to Jesus. He walked on the water. He focused on Jesus and he went to him. So don't miss all that as we very quickly go to see how he messed up. Don't miss the part that's out of his love, out of the faith that he had, out of the focus that he had on Jesus, that he went to him. Then, of course, verse 30. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. Right. So you know, as you've heard this in a sermon before, I'm sure, right? He takes his eyes off Jesus. He gets into that conflict that we all get into between sight and faith, right? Between what we see and what we know to be true in faith, right? It's that's the conflict that he's in the middle of. So obviously he's never been in this situation before. Walking on water. But what, you know, also recognize that as he sinks, the first thing he does is he yells out to Jesus to save him, right? He knows that Jesus has the power to save him. God brings us to these points of the end of our faith in order to increase our faith, and that's exactly what he has done to Peter here. He allows his faith to bring him out there, and he's testing his faith. James says the testing of our faith is for our perfection. I know there's a word there. All right, let's look at 31. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" He immediately caught him. The other thing I find funny is he catches him, and then the two of them, they're standing there on the waves and having this little conversation, right? Oh ye of little faith, why do you doubt? Right? All that conversation happens out there, standing on the water, while the disciples are all back in the boat. I just find that to be, why didn't he go back in the boat and have this conversation with them? Anyway, why did Peter doubt? Why did Peter doubt? It says that he doubted. Well, you of little faith, why do you doubt? Why did he doubt?
I think he started thinking about it. He moved from faith in his heart to walk out on the water to starting to think about it.
Verse 30 says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid. So he took his eyes off Jesus. He looked at where he was and what was around him, just like you said.
What's interesting is when he does sink, he yells out to Jesus to save him. So he knows Jesus has the power to do something about this, right? Isn't that fascinating?
Don't we do that in our own lives?
Yeah.
You know, we're in a crisis, we pray for help, we know he's got the power to do it, and we look back to our circumstances and let him overwhelm us.
I mean, Peter's human. I mean, we're all, this is just the human condition.
Yeah. I just want you to see it, right? That's all. There's nothing special else to be said. Now, to go back to David's point earlier, he says here, "O you of little faith," right? Not "O you of no faith," but "O you of little faith." So what you see here is that Peter does have faith. Dagnabbit, he steps out of the boat and walks on the water. He's got some faith, baby. He's got some faith. It got him out of the boat, but it didn't quite get him to Jesus, right? He has a little faith. He has enough faith to get out of the boat. And I think that Jesus here wants to increase his faith, right? Wants to show him that he can do more. If you remember back at the end, excuse me, that's some crud this morning. At the end of Luke in chapter 22, when Jesus has this conversation with Peter, and he says, "I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail you," right? Jesus is praying for us that our faith will not fail in the midst of the storm. I just don't want you to forget that. Jesus is praying for us in the midst of the storm, that our faith will not fail, that our faith will be increased. He has the power to rescue us and the will. By the way, if our boats are pointed towards Capernaum, right? If we are being obedient, I got to say this. Peter had enough faith to get out of the boat and walk on the water. Do we have enough faith to get out of the boat and walk on the water? If Jesus says, come, if Jesus says, do this, do we have the faith to take the first couple of steps, maybe then sink, have to call out to Jesus to pull us up, right? But I think I'll just be honest with me. I'm in the boat with the rest of the disciples going, go, Peter, go. You can do it, buddy, right? I'm not out there taking the step. I just think that, Peter has some little faith that's way bigger than my little faith to be able to step out on that and to go into the Go and start the thing that Jesus wants him to start. Go and do the thing that Jesus wants. Jesus is telling all of us to do something, and we are not stepping forward. Our little faith is not big enough. Remember, if you had the faith of a mustard seed, right? Little faith, it doesn't take a lot. It takes that first step, that second step, that third step. By the way, Peter, wow, we are out of time, aren't we? Who's watching the clock?
Yeah. Look at the clock. We're talking forums, and there's a lot of little things. And again, I'm thinking personal. A lot of times I pray, if it be your will, but I'm really praying if you can. It's a question whether you can. I'm the one who's questioning, can you? And it should be, we know you can do this, please do it. But we still have that lack.
Yep, good point. I think I'm going to stop here because I don't want to diminish the lessons in 32 and 33. So I'm going to stop here and we'll wrap this up next time. But let's kind of remember what we have seen already, right? So my question was, why are they worshiping him, right? And they're worshiping him because he's shown them authority. He's shown them control over all things. He's shown them protection and care and providence for them, right? He's shown them that he can see them in the midst of all that they are going through, right? He's shown them a special kind of love, the love between that he's shown to Peter here, the love that Peter has shown to him, right? For all of these reasons, they're worshiping him and treating him as divine, treating him as God. So that let's just pause there. I don't have a lot more, but I want to make sure we have time for prayer this morning. So we'll finish this up next time. Any other thoughts on this before we close it down, though? Because this is, again, this is the miracle that absolutely transforms the disciples. So any other thoughts before we go on? All right. All right. Whoa, Hugh's not here, is he? So I guess I need to capture the prayer request.
Turn off the recording.
Recording.
Thank you, Klaus. All right, what do we got in the way of prayer?